turns 3 o'clock.
Good afternoon. I'm doing this program particularly because one of you sitting out there noticed that I had skipped it earlier. Your name is Ruben. So now I'm not skipping it. And it starts, unfortunately, on a very sad note. I got a phone call this week, and my best friend in college, a New York actor now, had just died of COVID. And I had been a friend of his since college, seen him marry a wonderful woman, Susan, saw their birth of their one daughter, Lucy, and saw the plays that he was in New York. So I'm feeling sort of down. I'm not very good at death and dying. Who is? And it'll take some time to get over this shock. It reminds me, though, of a story that my parents told from long, long ago. When I was born at Fortress Monroe, Virginia, and I hit 3 months, my mother put me in a basket. I thought she thought I was related to Moses. And she took me in the basket on a long 3-month journey. We went from Virginia to New York by train. From New York, we went by boat to Cuba. From Cuba, we went through the canal. From the canal, we went up to Los Angeles. From LA, we went out to Hawaii. And then we went to our destination, which was a rock, a very big rock. It was the Gibraltar of the American colony of the Philippines. And my dad was assigned there and had gone earlier to get us quarters. And so we came to live in the Philippines, and my mother and father remember it fondly. And then suddenly reports began to arrive. Quite obviously, Japanese submarines were being sighted in Manila Bay. So somebody in the War Department woke up and decided it was time to ship out all the families and leave just the cadre there manning the huge guns. If you've ever seen the film, The Guns of Navarone, then you can imagine the size of these guns that were to protect the bay and its entry. They were very much like the British version, which was in Singapore, guarding the approaches to that island city off the tip of Malaya. So it was that when the word came, we left. And we went by ship and zigzagged our way to Hawaii, and then zigzagged our way down to the South American coast, and then back up through the canal and back to New York. And while most people don't know it because they've seen a famous movie with Deborah Carr, Burt Lancaster, Frank Sinatra, about the attack on Pearl Harbor, or they've seen other movies that stress that disastrous day, a day that will live in infamy, according to the president at the time, FDR. But they don't realize that the Philippines were attacked at the same time. both Clark Air Force Base and Subic Bay. And then the islands were invaded. The reason that it reminds me of my mom and dad is that those people who stayed where my dad left because he got to command a ship full of mothers and children. I was a terrible kid. I bit people. And usually my parents put a dog leash on me and tied me outside the cabin while they changed clothes for dinner. And one night, the captain of the ship came down the gangway, and patted me on the head, which I hated. And so I lifted his trouser leg and took a bite out of his leg. And after that, I was sort of quarantined. No one wanted to get near me, which was fine with me. So my parents talked often about this time because they felt badly about the death of a number of people. When the families left Corregidor, the soldiers, coast artillerymen as they're called, were left behind. And when the Japanese, knowing what they knew, smarter than we were, did attack, they attacked coming down the Bataan Peninsula, which was to the north of Corregidor. And the guns did not point in that direction. So Corregidor fell. They did the same thing in Malaya. They came down through the jungle, through the back door, and Singapore fell. The Anglo-Americans had been outfoxed by these very powerful Asian people who were determined to dominate much of Asia. So it was that the guys who were on the island, the rock, our Gibraltar, were captured. And they were taken by the Japanese up the Bataan Peninsula on a death march. And only maybe 40% of them survived. And somehow the word got out who they were, because there was a big underground, Filipinos who remained loyal. Not that they wanted to be an American colony, but they didn't want to switch from being Spanish to being American and now to being Japanese. They wanted something called freedom. Amazing that they would want to be free. And so it was that my mom and my dad kept hearing about the ones who had died, many of them their best friends. And when I heard that David Little, my friend, had died, I had that same kind of feeling, I think, that I lost a part of my own life. Anyway, today's lecture is about that Pacific War and the man who dominated the horizon, and that is, of course, General of the Armies Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur became known as the American Caesar. He had a very, very long career. He knew everybody, was considered a very important figure, and he was actually in World War I. And he feared no fear, so he would shine his boots and walk along the top of the trench line. A very dangerous thing to do, given that the nearby Germans, our enemy, had both machine guns and field artillery pieces. But he rose to the rank of brigadier, one-star general. Then he came home, a hero, and finally rose in rank and became chief of staff of the army, which is a very high-ranking position, and was there to put down the Veterans March, which occurred in the 1930s during the Great Depression. That's how he got to know Franklin Roosevelt and the Roosevelts as a family. Douglas MacArthur was a very good-looking man, and he was a bachelor. So he was well known in circles as the big catch. He did finally marry a very socially prominent woman from Virginia, my hometown, my home state. And it's the reason that his famous monument of a library and a museum is located in Norfolk, Virginia, Norfolk being the great seaport on the Atlantic that is the home of the Atlantic Fleet today, where you see all the great carriers, except the Nimitz, the great nuclear carrier, because it's coming back to California, having left the Persian Gulf. One of the few smart things we've done in the last 60 days is to get the hell out of town. You might note a certain tone in my voice because I've been reading the New York Times and the unbelievable attempt to blackmail the Georgia leadership into changing the vote by our current president is scandalous, to say the least, and is impeachable without a doubt. But why impeach him? He's been impeached once, and those goons in the Senate don't seem to understand that. So in a few days, we will be rid of this pestilence known as Donald Trump. But on with MacArthur. MacArthur then retired. He had a family estate in the Philippines, and it was always assumed that he would return there. He was called out of retirement after Pearl Harbor and was therefore the most senior officer, naval, air, marine, or army, on active duty. He and his wife came to Corregidor, but way too late. They had to escape at the last minute in a PT boat. On his way to Australia by PT boat, he sent a message to the War Department. There was no Pentagon or Defense Department. And to the War Department, he sent the following note: I plan to tell the country the following: I shall return, Douglas MacArthur. His seniors, but not in rank, only by title, sent a rather meek reply saying, we think it would be wiser and more patriotic to say, we shall return. Well, if you know Douglas MacArthur as I do, the message came, I shall return. There was no we involved. And so it was that MacArthur set himself a pattern that was to play out through both World War I, World War II, the Korean War, all of the big engagements of the 20th century, unless you want to include the war we lost, better known as the Vietnam War. So it was that MacArthur left, and so it was that the war went on. Now, in naval warfare and in the history of it, there are two big events in the 20th century. The first involves the big naval ship of World War I, and that's the battleship, or as known in Europe, the dreadnoughts. And they only saw action once, when the Kaiser allowed his great battle fleet to leave the area of the island redoubts off the Danish coast, known as Jutland. The British Imperial Navy, which was then gathered together in the great naval base in Scotland, came out to do battle. And there was the one battle, the Battle of Jutland, and the Kaiser saw that his fleet was being damaged and ordered them back into the safety of the island network. And that was the end of World War I naval battle. So it's rather amazing that at the very end of World War I, the British, always tinkering with something better, they took the basic outline of a huge new dreadnought, and, or if you wish, battleship, and they put a flight deck on it. And so now you have the first aircraft carrier, the Ark Royal of 1918 fame, and airplanes flew from its deck. So it was that this innovative process was launched, and by the time of World War II, the aircraft carrier was the primary naval force, because you have to understand the Pacific Ocean is very, very big. And what you need to fight in the Pacific is an island you can float forward. And that's what these big carriers were. They were islands that you could bring forward near enough to be able to launch the airplanes from the flight deck and take them to the battle scene, fight the opposing either carrier or the carrier force or just the aircraft off the enemy carrier, and declare either victory or know that you had lost. We tried that at the Battle of Coral Sea, the first big engagement. You have to understand that when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, there was a very good Japanese admiral, Yamamoto. And Yamamoto had warned the Japanese not to attack, but when he saw that the army generals, like General Tojo, had decided against his advice, he stayed with his side and tried to help them. And Yamamoto kept asking all during the attack on Pearl, where are the carriers? Because he was getting eyewitness reports of the sinking of the various battleships that we were to lose. In fact, we were to lose our entire surface fleet, except by sheer accident, the carriers had gone to sea, and so we're not at Pearl at the time of the attack. And so in the Battle of Coral Sea, our aircraft carriers were there to engage, and the next big battle, Midway, we were there to engage again. And in the case of Midway, we won, they lost. And then the next biggest battle will be the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where again, we will win and they will lose. The Japanese had built a bigger ship than we, not a bigger carrier, but a bigger battleship. We couldn't build what's so big. Our battleships had something on the order of 12-inch or 14-inch, but there is a 16-inch battleship, two of them built by the Japanese, and both were sunk during the war. But the Japanese did the best they could. And suddenly, while we had great antipathy towards the Germans and the German use of submarines during World War I, we were the great submariners of World War II. We were the ones, and our submarines were the objects that actually sank most of the Japanese fleet. Japan is an island, 4 main home islands, and it needs to be fed, and it needs the raw materials to keep a war machine going. And as it was, we sank those ships full of rice coming from French Indochina, which had been overrun by the Japanese, or keeping out rubber, which was from Malaya, which had been overrun, the British colony, by the Japanese. And we also were short of those things, except that we learned quickly to use our chemistry industry, and we made synthetic rubber as a replacement for the real rubber that we couldn't get anymore. So everyone was in a race for supplies. Now, I know you're going to find the following hard to understand, but the Japanese had a propaganda weapon stronger than ours. They called their New World Order the Japanese co-prosperity sphere. And this sphere was anti-colonial. In other words, they pronounced that they were liberating the Philippines from the American colonists. They were liberating the Dutch East Indies from the conquering Dutch. They were liberating Indochina, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam from the colonial Americans. And they were liberating Singapore, Hong Kong, and they were also liberating China from those people who had interfered internally with Chinese affairs. And so it went down fairly well, this argument that the Japanese, the new liberators of Asia, and they used that weapon all the way to the gates of India, where they were finally stopped. But when they stopped, they had gone all the way around Asia on the coastal side. They'd already long ago taken Korea. They have a very black eye from the years that they were in Korea, because the Japanese army wanted women. And so many thousands of Korean, North and South Korean young girls were turned into comfort women. That was their code name, which meant they were simply prostitutes who were taken around Asia to service the young Japanese soldiers, which has despoiled relations with Korea to this very, very day, very much resented, and for good reason. And the Koreans remember when they, in fact, were able to beat the Japanese in a famous case in which the Japanese were invading many centuries ago. The Koreans were the first, not us, but the Koreans, to build an ironclad ship, like the Monitor and the Merrimack, which fought off the waters of Virginia and the Chesapeake Bay. Well, the Koreans did it before us, hard as that is to believe. And they won a great naval battle. In fact, destroying the invading army of the Japanese viceroy. And so it was that we have this combination of events. We have MacArthur having fled, saying he will return. We have the British desperately trying to hold the line. In India, they'd already sent their best battleship to Asian waters, and Japanese fighter planes, land-based, had sunk the battleship, proving that Billy Mitchell was right and everyone else was wrong, that Navy ships could be sunk by air forces. And so it was that everyone tried to gird their loins. Now, there was bound to be a fight between MacArthur and Nimitz. I've lectured this group before on the distinguishing aspects of Nimitz and Yamamoto, the great Japanese admiral. Yamamoto was, in fact, targeted. We broke their code. We heard where he was. We heard of a plane he was taking. We sent our planes up. They intercepted it and shot it down, and Yamamoto died in the crash of that airplane. A great Japanese admiral. Now it was time for the admiral, not just Nimitz, who before that had been professor of naval science at the University of California at Berkeley. In fact, the building he worked out of was named Nimitz Hall, which was burnt down by a bunch of thugs during the famous 60s at Berkeley, where thugs seemed to be supreme. So, Admiral King, who was chief of naval operations and served in the White House as naval advisor, and the major figure was General George Catlett Marshall, not a West Pointer, a graduate of VMI, the place where, if you don't know this town of Lexington, 2 colleges are there, Lexington, Virginia. One is the Virginia Military Institute, VMI. The other is Washington and Lee. And General Robert E. Lee, who everyone wants to seem to dig up, is buried there. So to bring peace, FDR, who I then was crippled by polio, decided he would fly out to the Pacific and meet with the major commanders and see if he could bring peace. And he did, at great difficulty for himself. They met on a carrier. Nimitz, Spruance, and others. Then the president arrived. Everyone was supposed to be there before the president arrives. One person wasn't there yet. You can guess who? Douglas MacArthur. And then MacArthur arrived, stepping out in a uniform he had designed, not a uniform that had been issued, with that corncob pipe stuck in his mouth. He never lit it. And he walked across the flight deck to where the president was sitting. And he looked down at Franklin and he said, "Good afternoon, Franklin." And Franklin said, "Good afternoon, Doug," because they knew each other socially, and also Doug had been chief of staff when FDR had to face the problems of the 30s and those military veterans who were demonstrating for their back pay that they thought they were due. At that point in time, the Navy should have known it had lost this battle. But they hung tough, and they were asked to present their case for a Central Pacific attack. That is, to skip all these islands that were down in the South Pacific, those islands that are going to be later highly celebrated by Michener in his famous Tales of the South Pacific, and then turned as a book into a book musical by Rodgers and Hammerstein as the great musical South Pacific. But now we were facing the battles that were to come. And Spruance and Nimitz and the others all felt strongly that a Central Pacific strategy was the wisest. That is, to go from where we were then straight towards Tokyo and Tokyo Bay, and to skip over all of this razzmatazz that Doug MacArthur wanted. And so they presented in detail what they would do and how they would do it. And then Doug spoke. He was opposed to this plan. He wanted a plan that was oriented towards the large islands. And particularly, he had a card he was going to play. And looking straight at President Roosevelt, he said, "I don't know how anyone could explain how we would leave our suffering GIs, those veterans that are being held like animals in POW camps in the Philippines, how we would skip them, skip over them, not rescue them, instead go on towards what was called Formosa in those days in Taiwan today, and strike at Japan." Now, Franklin Roosevelt was the epitome of a political animal. And once he heard the threat that it would be Douglas MacArthur who would report to the American people through his various sources that we were leaving a huge group of American POWs suffering horribly in the Philippines, as well as Filipinos who were working in a underground war against the Japanese. And so MacArthur won. There was no way that that story was going to get out because it wasn't going to happen. The Navy could complain all it wanted to, but we were going to the Philippines. And we were going to get there by island hopping from one group of islands to the other. And we could do it very quickly because both Nimitz, Spruance, and MacArthur knew something about the Japanese. They had a series of concentric island posts that worked their way all the way across the Pacific, almost to Hawaii, meaning that we would have to fight one after the other. And the Japanese expected us to be exhausted and give up. But we knew that we could jump over some of these. Let me give you an example. Rabaul. Rabaul had a force of 50,000 Japanese troops on it. It would be a killer to try and take Rabaul. So don't take it. Jump over it and move on to a lightly defended island and take that. And then as you hop over islands, there's no way the Japanese Navy can get in to resupply. And 50,000 Japanese cannot survive without resupply on Rabaul. And they didn't. And they ended up surrendering. In fact, years after the war, some Japanese soldiers, loyal always to the emperor, decided they would not, in fact, surrender. And they went off into the jungle. And the war was over. And they finally, years later, 47, 48, they came out of the jungle. and wanted to know what was going on. They were there to defend Japan, and Japan had been defeated 3 years before that. Strange, this war in the Philippines or in the South Pacific. And so it was that we did what we did. We attacked, hence the famous Battle of the Philippine Sea, the destruction of the super battleship the Japanese had built, plus the destruction of much of their Navy force, particularly by Spruance, who cut in behind them and tore through their ranks. So it was that these big naval battles, first Coral Sea, then Midway, a gigantic victory for the Americans, and then the Battle of the Philippine Sea, made us the rulers of the Pacific. But the ones that were most successful and the ones that we felt embarrassed by because we had always condemned them were American submarines, because it was the submarines that sank the Japanese commercial fleet. And without a commercial fleet, that is a fleet that could bring the oil that was needed from Dutch Indonesia, to bring the rubber that was needed from British Malaya, to bring the tons and tons and tons of rice that was sitting in French Indochina. All of this couldn't make it if the submarines kept sinking these supply ships. And so it was that Douglas MacArthur saw his way to another set of victories and ended up almost killing the U.S. Navy by going on board the USS Missouri, a great battleship of the American Navy, and sitting there accepting the surrender of the Japanese. The American Navy will never, ever get over that. And then it was MacArthur, not Nimitz, not Spruance, not anybody else but MacArthur, who was made Supreme Allied Commander of the Japanese occupying army. He moved his headquarters to the Daiichi building in downtown Tokyo, to the third floor of the Daiichi building. From that floor, you could look down at the Japanese imperial family's home in the palace. And it was not only the Japanese family that MacArthur was interested in, it was saving that family. There was a great demand for the execution of the emperor. But a very famous American sociologist, a woman, wrote a book. You should read it sometime, it's still in print. The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. And the book points out the absolute incredible importance of the Japanese emperor. In olden days, he was thought of as a living god. That was to end, for sure. But he was to live, according to MacArthur. And MacArthur had himself photographed many times in the Daiichi building and outside it with the emperor. They're rather peculiar photographs because MacArthur was 6'3" and the emperor was like 5 foot. So it was Mutt and Jeff, but it was 2 living Mutts and a living Jeff. MacArthur also saw to it that the Russians would have nothing. The Soviet Union was not invited to partake There were war trials, and there were several Japanese generals who were executed. But it wasn't like Nuremberg. It was a different war with a different victor. MacArthur designed his office in a certain way. His desk was on a dais. So therefore, when you came in, he was always seated, but he was seated higher than you were standing. Not only that, there was no inbox and no outbox. He did not fool with paper. Underlings did that. When Mrs. MacArthur, this Virginia socialite he had married, went shopping downtown, they completely closed down the Ginza. Let me tell you what the Ginza is. The Ginza is like the Fifth Avenue of Tokyo. Can you imagine closing down Fifth Avenue just because Mrs. Biden is going to go shopping in Saks? Never happened. Well, it happened in Tokyo. The Ginza closed, she shopped, she left, the Ginza opened. He was, in fact, what Manchester in his famous book later called him, the American Caesar, in all ways. And he had his way. No one crossed him. He was senior to everybody. Unfortunately, he was a Caesar in a non-Caesarian country. Americans are not Roman Empire builders. In fact, we do very badly at it, thank God. So the day would come. One more meeting at sea. As you know, Franklin died in Warm Springs, Georgia. His wife got the news in the White House, called the Senate, asked the Vice President to come to the White House. When he did, and he opened the door, Eleanor said, "Good afternoon, Mr. President." That was all Harry Truman knew, that he was Vice President. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the worst administrator who had ever been President of the United States. He kept nobody informed on anything. Truman knew nothing about the A-bomb, which was soon to be used. He knew nothing about the decisions made at Yalta, which divided up Europe. He knew nothing about anything. And so it was that he became president. He was very lucky in that he inherited a group that we historians call wise men. People like General Marshall, people like Dean Acheson. All of these people willing to serve him loyally. So it was that Harry decided he needed to have a Pacific Ocean conference on Wake Island with, in fact, Douglas MacArthur. And as usual, Harry showed up, no Douglas. Everyone else showed up, no Douglas. Then Douglas showed up. It was obvious that Douglas MacArthur considered Harry to be a haberdasher, a man who'd been in menswear and way beneath him in social standing. So it was that they met, they discussed, and MacArthur went back to Tokyo. Then, on a frightful day in June, 20th, I think it was, 70,000 North Korean troops, led by Soviet-furnished T-34 tanks, crossed the 38th parallel, and the Korean War began. It so happened that the Soviet ambassador to the UN, a guy who always was walking out of the UN, had just walked out again. And so Atchison was instructed by Truman to go get a declaration of condemnation of this invasion by the UN, and he got it because Wyszynski was not there. And so we have this UN declaration. We have the American Caesar in Tokyo appointed as UN commander, not just US, but UN. And we have many countries coming to the aid of Korea. The British came, the Thais came. Everyone who could offer some support came. Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans. But we fell back. In fact, one of our most famous generals forgot to fall back fast enough. General Dean, he was captured by the North Koreans in Daejeon, a city halfway down the Korean peninsula as seen from South Korea. And yet we were able to form a defense line around the seaport of Busan, called the Busan or Pusan in the old days with a P instead of a B. And we were able to hold. And here we go again, Douglas MacArthur. He's going to save the day, and he actually does. He proposes to, by then we have a Defense Department and a Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of them really junior to MacArthur. He proposes an end run while everyone is way down south trying to overrun us. He is going to make an end run. He's going to go around the peninsula and go halfway up to the big city and seaport of Incheon. And he will do an invasion there. Now, this is very dangerous, and the Navy people are really upset. And everyone says, no, this is not doable. The South Korean coast on that side has race tides that go way, way out. And when they turn, and the incoming tide comes in so fast it can outrun a human and you can drown. It's absolutely an impossible. And that's exactly what Mr. Impossible planned to do. The possible was always possible to Mr. Impossible, to Mr. MacArthur. And so he pulls off the Incheon invasion. He does insult to the Navy that they never forgave. He used the battleship Missouri for in-close firing. The battleship Missouri can fire a 1-ton shell 10 miles inland, reaching the outskirts of Seoul, the capital of South Korea. It's unbelievable, but it's so. And the Americans pour ashore. Yes, they do get troubles with these tides. The battleship Missouri, in fact, had to go in so close, and then the tide went out and it got stuck. Now, I don't know if you know many Navy people, but they do not like to run aground under any circumstances. It's the perfect way to lose your command. And there was the Missouri stuck in the mud. And what did MacArthur care? Not a bit. He was going for the gold. He had put ashore a force strong enough to disconnect, to cut the supply chain that runs down a very mountainous peninsula. Very modern state today, South Korea, but very not modern in in 1950. And so it is that he cuts the supply line. The big North Korean army that's way down south is cut off from supply and surrenders. MacArthur has won again, but MacArthur's not satisfied with one win. He orders the force of Bulldog Walker and other generals, Matthew Ridgway is there, to go north, not to stop at the 38th parallel, which is what most people thought we would do after all. That's what they had done. They had illegally crossed and we had taken it back. Now, why are we taking North Korea? Well, we're going to take it, says MacArthur, and we do. We get up to Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, we take it. We get up further and further. Finally, the Indian ambassador at the UN comes to see our ambassador and says, I have word for you that you are not going to like. The Chinese have brought a major force to their border with North Korea. They strongly advise that you go nowhere near the Yalu River, their border. MacArthur doesn't take advice from Americans. Why should he take it from Indian ambassadors who are reporting on what the Chinese are doing? Who cares what the Chinese are doing? We should have never let them fall to Mao Zedong to begin with, as seen by MacArthur. So he does send. He sends two messages. One, the war should be over soon, and the famous American message is just sent always. The troops should be home by Christmas. Well, they weren't. And it was to be that the Chinese did intervene because we did come all the way to the Yalu. We took pictures of ourselves walking along the banks of the Yalu. And the Chinese entered in force, and we fell back, and we continued to fall back. And we fell all the way back to Seoul. Here's the poor South Korean capital. It's fallen 4 times. It's nothing but a hulk of a ruin, nothing there to save. We got onto the other side of the Han River. The Han River is the big river that runs south of Seoul, and we put a defense line there. MacArthur was furious. How dare they? Now people were really jittery. You see, there had been a guy who had gone to Berkeley and studied nuclear physics and then had returned to China and built the Chinese an A-bomb. It'd be bad enough to have to fight millions and millions of Chinese, red Chinese, but to fight them when they had the A-bomb was not a good idea. And so it was that General MacArthur decided to write a famous letter to Representative Martin, a Republican in Congress. And he wrote the letter, which basically said, my hands are tied. I need to be able to use nuclear weapons. Not only did he write that, which was very impolite, but Martin published it in the Congressional Record for all to see. Well, that was the final straw. That night, in Tokyo, in his residence, MacArthur and his wife were having dinner. A top secret cable had been received. MacArthur's aide came in and said, sir, there's a cable here for you. And MacArthur said, read it. His aide-de-camp said, "It's from the president." MacArthur said, "Read it." It went, quote, "As of midnight tonight, you are relieved of all your duties and placed on the retired rolls," end quote. Truman had fired MacArthur. The unbelievable was now believable. And Ridgway took over. Finally, after an ugly, long year, a truce was signed. We've never signed a treaty. We still live with the 38th parallel as the dividing line. MacArthur returned to a tumultuous greeting. The American people were against Truman, even though General Marshall turned to Truman and said, "You should have fired that bastard years ago." MacArthur was invited to give a speech to the joint session of Congress. He did. Very famous speech. He's a very good speechwriter. He ended it in the very famous phrase, quote, "Old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And so this old soldier fades away," end quote. He received a tumultuous parade down Fifth Avenue. Millions came out to greet him. He went to West Point, where he had been captain of cadets and graduated with honors, and gave another famous speech, "Duty, honor, country." I was then doing grad work and had gone to the Truman Library. So I went to check, since they save everything, on the American reaction. And the mail had come by the millions. It was unbelievable. And the mail ran 10-1 in MacArthur's favor. Nevertheless, he was fired. He went on with his wife to live the rest of his life in the Waldorf Astoria in New York City, a great hotel. Franklin Roosevelt had once asked Doug, "Why don't you come home?" And MacArthur had looked at him rather quizzically and said, "I don't know what home is. I don't think I've ever had one." Sad. You can stay in the Waldorf, and you can stay in the apartment complex, rather expensive, that MacArthur used. I did that once when I led a group of California alumni from Berkeley for a week of New York theater. And it was a rather peculiar feeling to be where this man, who my father greatly admired, strange the ways of the Americans. We went on, of course, Truman decided against some people's advice, even the Berkeley physicists who invented, if you wish, one of the two A-bombs that were built by hand. He wanted it to be dropped on a desolate island, deserted, Truman decided no, that it would be dropped on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki. And with the second bomb, Japan did surrender. Horrible, horrible was the immediate aftermath of the bomb in the immediate area. I've gone to Nagasaki. It's not pleasant. But life is what it is. Truman said he was never, ever sorry that he made that decision. And so these characters have marched out of history. MacArthur's gone, Truman's gone, Ridgway's even gone. All those people who mattered. So, and guess what? I'm going to be gone because we've run out of time again. Thank you very much for coming today. I hope you learned something about some aspect of MacArthur and his role in American history and of the great naval battles of World War II with Nimitz and Spruance in command, Coral Sea, Midway, Battle of the Philippines, and the fact that the first great aircraft carrier was British, the Ark Royal, and we went on to build even greater ones. The Nimitz, which is coming back to San Diego, thank God, getting out of harm's way in the Persian Gulf. The last thing we need, what we really need, of course, is for the president to be re-impeached for the dreadful thing he did in Georgia. But why waste the time? He'll be gone soon, and it can't be fast enough. Again, thanks for listening. Come back next week. We're going to look at Canada and Mexico, our two neighbors who we keep invading and insulting, and they remain friendly. Amazing. See you then.